Ronald, thanks for tuning in once again. Joshua versus Paul, I'm happy to see the knockout. Let's recap the fight. I was happy to see the knockout, as many people would be. Joshua finally, or somebody finally knocks out Jake Paul. Jake Paul's been on a run for a long time, saying, hey, he's the best to do it. He's called out Canelo. He's now actually fought Joshua, a fight that I didn't think would take place. Because I knew that Joshua wouldn't allow the fight to go the distance. I knew that Joshua had a lot of pressure on him to knock out Jake Paul. Let's face it, Joshua coming off a embarrassing loss, you could say, against Dubois, getting dropped numerous times, getting knocked out cold, and he hasn't returned 15 months, since then. He's been inactive, you could say, out for the year. So Joshua, he couldn't show up to this fight and not get the knockout against a YouTuber, you could say. Jake Paul's had a few fights, but nothing too serious. His last fight was against a senior citizen, wasn't it? And that fight went the distance. So, and that fight was scripted, 100%. I believe it was scripted. And this fight, was this one scripted? I don't think it was. I just think that Joshua was just, he had ring rust. He was out of the ring. I know that he's fighting a YouTuber, but, the guy's running away. It's a big ring, it's bigger than usual. When a guy doesn't want to engage and he tries to survive, it's tricky. It's quite hard to knock them out, especially when they're louder than you and they basically running away. That's what I saw anyway. I don't know what everyone else saw. But I was happy to see the knockout. I would have preferred it to be earlier. I would have preferred it to be within 2 rounds, just because I wanted the clown show to finish. I was over this guy calling everyone out and, saying, hey, I'm the best and I'm going to wipe out the cruiserweight division. Ramirez, you're next. All these comments from a guy that hasn't really fought anyone at the top, And now he fought a former champion, a hard-hitting, blessed puncher, and, he suffered the consequences. Joshua was never going to just allow him to survive. What I do question, though, is why Joshua didn't take his gloves off after the fight. Was there more padding in there? Was there another clause in there that we never knew about where Joshua had to wear more padding in the gloves? I'm not sure, but, it's just a bit odd that he never took his gloves off after the fight. It's almost like he was hiding something. He was walking around doing interviews with his gloves still on. He was walking around after the fight with his gloves on. Usually you take the gloves off after the fight, but regardless of that, he still had power to break Jake's jaw. I believe Jake Paul will never return to the heavyweight division again. I don't even think he was there anyway. The exhibition fight where he fought Mike Tyson, although it was on the record, that was a clown show, wasn't it? That was an unfair fight. It just seemed like Mike Tyson wasn't really throwing hard or throwing at all. He was quite, Father Time wasn't on his side. Jake Paul wasn't really engaging. So this was the only real heavyweight that he's fought. And he's in hospital, isn't he? So, at the end of the day, I'm happy that Joshua got the knockout. I was hoping that he'll get the knockout, and I'm glad that he did. I was glad to see Jake Paul knocked out, and there wasn't much he could really say after the fight. The only thing that he can really take away from this fight is I survived longer, but I mean, how do you survive if you're not engaging? You know, that's another um, thing that you got to consider. You know, people are saying, well, you know, he lasted longer than Ngannou, and you know, but Ngannou was engaging. Ngannou was there to fight. Jake Paul wasn't there to fight. He was there to survive. He was there to run away. He was there to last. He knew that he had no chance. You know, everyone knew that he had no chance unless it was scripted. So yeah, that's how I saw it. Anyway, I was happy to see the knockout. I would have preferred it to be earlier, but you know, at the end of the day, um, good on Joshua for getting the knockout and keeping the boxing public happy. Hopefully, Jake Paul, he's not as big-headed anymore, and understands that this isn't a game. Leave your take anyway, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.